And thank you to all of you for joining us today. I'm excited to be able to talk to you about the Kronos Workforce Ready API and what it can do for you. It's really just a great resource to being able to elegantly interface your BeyondPay with data with some of your other business systems. Oh, having a little technical difficulty here. There we go. So, like, it can elegantly interface with your other business systems, like your accounting systems, your 401k providers, benefit providers. We had a really interesting project recently where we were able to send SMS text messages to managers who had outstanding time entries to approve, and that was all done using the API that we're talking about today. So hopefully this will spark some ideas. We aren't assuming that you have any technical knowledge, but if you do have some experience, some API experience specifically, I still encourage you to stick around. We will be providing some first steps that are specific to the Workforce Ready API and some other useful documentation as well. But let's first do a little dive into what it actually is and a little bit about how to actually use it. So I think the first place to start is by answering the general question, what is an API? So an API is an acronym for Application Programming Interface. So developers of an application like the Workforce Ready application will sometimes expose functionality through an API so that other programs can interact with it outside of the application's graphical user interface. So what does that actually mean? So when you open a browser and you type a web address on the URL line, let's say beyondpay.com, you're making a request to a browser. The web server responds by sending back some HTML code to your browser. Now your browser works to make it pretty and fun and present it in a way that people find it pleasing. This interaction is meant for human consumption. But a REST API works with the same request response model, except that the audience is not intended to be a person using a browser, but another program. So here's a screen of an image of what you would likely see if you were to view job requisitions in BeyondPay. I've navigated to a menu which made a request to a web server that in turn returned some HTML code to my browser, which has displayed it very nicely for us to view. Well, the Workforce Ready API also has the same requisition data that can be returned in the format that a program can work with. So on the left, you can see there's a request, and it looks a lot like an HTML address that you would put in a web page, but it's actually a REST request. And what it returns is not HTML that's rendered pretty in your browser, but in this case, it's returning JSON, a language that's easily manipulated to be used by a programmer. And if you're not a programmer at all, I mean, you can look at the response that's returned in JSON and you can see that there's some useful information in there. You can see that there's a job title, a location, a job description. Now, this is the happy path. So we've made a request and we got back a response that we liked. It returned our job data. So if you look at that request string on the left, and I've made it a little bit bold, so hopefully it's easier for you to find, you can see that there's a CID in that request. That's for a placeholder for a company ID. So now in this example, when I put the company ID in there, I put in a company ID that has the recruitment module enabled, so I was able to see the data. When I make this request using the company ID of a company that does not have the recruitment module enabled, this is what I get. So I made the same request, but I get, it's an error, but it's a reasonable response actually. It's telling me I don't have that functionality enabled for my company. Which then brings us back to, well, using this REST API, what data can I see? So 3 things to keep in mind when you're thinking about the data that you want to retrieve using the API. The first thing is not everything is going to be available. Not all the functionality that you're able to use in BeyondPay has been exposed and available to you in the form of using the API. Next, some availability is going to be dependent upon what your installed modules are, just like the example that we just had with returning the job recruitment data. The third thing to keep in mind are your security profiles. When you make an API call, you will usually be doing it with the credentials of an actual user in the system. The security profile of the credentials that you are using will determine what is accessible through the API. So if a user does not have access to a report, when that user is authenticated and wants to return data from a report, if it doesn't have access to it in BeyondPay, you're not going to have access to it in the API. Now, in our earlier example, when we retrieved the job recruitment data, we didn't need to authenticate with the username and a password. That data is publicly accessible data, so we didn't need it. But that is usually not the case, and you will be required to authenticate. So to authenticate, we're going to need 3 pieces of data. Well, first you're going to need, the first bullet item there is actually, again, it looks like a web a URL that you'd put in your browser, but it's actually a REST request. And it's the REST request that we would use for login. And that request is going to require a valid username and a password, and also an API key. API keys are generated and are unique to each company. So nobody shares an API key, but you will only have one API key for your company. But think of this as a 3-legged table, where if one fails, the whole table will fail. So if you're, if the user that you're using to authenticate, if they're terminated in the system, if their password changes, your API request will fail. If your company API key is regenerated for any reason and your application hasn't been updated, and you're still using the old API key, all of your REST requests will fail. So keep that in mind. So that was our request. Remember, we're working on a request response kind of model. So using here, let me go back. So we used our request, our login request, our username, our password, and our API key. Now we get a response back. And the response back that we get is that token that you see on the bottom. That token will live for 1 hour, and that's the token that you will use when you make any subsequent API requests. So I feel like we kind of got lost in the weeds there, but I'd like to step back and give us like a bigger picture here. So the Workforce Ready API works with a request response model. So, and what we've been doing so far is how to get and make requests to and from BeyondPay. But the beauty of this model is that we can now interact with the data with other applications that have APIs. Before I go to the next slide, on this slide you see that we have the REST request, and it's going from BeyondPay to a custom application. So these API requests will be made from your application. So now in the bigger picture, we have requests that are going back from our application to and from BeyondPay to gain access to data, to put data into BeyondPay. But really now, with that data, we can then make other requests to other applications, like a business intelligence application or our SMS servicing messages like I brought up earlier. We had used Twilio to do that. So we sparked some ideas, hopefully, on how you might use it, but how do you actually get started? So the first thing first is, if you did want to start using the API, please contact us. There's a couple of things that we need to do. We have to enable a marketplace item, and we'd also have to generate an API key for your company to be using. Now, if you have your own programming talent in-house, that's great. Then you can just hit the ground running. We'll give you the documentation and your API key and turn on your marketplace items, and you can get going. But if for some reason you can't use your in-house or you don't have an in-house talent available to you, contact us if you have an idea. We do have that expertise in-house, and we'd be happy to talk to you about your projects and see if we can get you going. And here's the reference for the API reference, which would be your Bible. That's going to give you all your information if you're technical and you're on the line on all of the requests that are available to you and what their responses can return. And of course, you can always reach out to us also. So I'd like to open it up to any questions that you may have. I know it was a little quick and brief.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much, Liz. And if anybody's wondering if there'll be any follow-up from this conversation, we'll be sure to send out a recording of what Liz has discussed today. With that email, there will also be a link for you to be able to sign up for a 30-minute free, no obligation consultation, because the API has so many capabilities. There's really no way to pinpoint the availability to any one person or one company, depending on what their specific needs are. And we just got a question saying, please share the URL for the API reference. Definitely, that'll be also
absolutely
included. Yeah, we'll definitely get that over to you guys in an email as well, so you can, those that are more technical can browse through it, or you can go ahead and forward it to your technical staff that's in-house or third party. But all the information will be followed up later this afternoon, so you guys have that on. You will have that on hand. But essentially, this is just a brief introduction, trying to keep it as high level as possible, but letting you know what exactly an API is, and opening up the conversation for you to reach back out, either through the meeting link that we'll be sending out, or just feel free to always reach out to support@beyondpay.com so we can get that meeting set up with you with either it would be Liz Badenhausen or another solution specialist to see where your needs lie and see what we can do specifically for you, and we can scope out the project, see who needs to be involved, and all of the important next steps. So with that, we finished a few minutes early, but I don't think anybody's complaining. We all have plenty to get back to, but thanks so much for your time, everyone, and we look forward to speaking to you all in the near future. Have a great rest of your afternoon.